These days, when you bring up intermediate term science fiction about space colonization, a lot of people think of The Expanse, which I'll get to eventually. It's a future that's familiar enough. We see how we get there from here, and it's not all roses and replicators. Humanity going about the dirty business of settling the solar system. But there's another book series, an indie book at that I think really deserves a lot more recognition than it gets for its portrayal of humanity building functioning societies out there while still being tied to the present day powers of Earth and without having to bring aliens into it. The Human Reach series by John Lumpkin tracks closely to this relatively near-term, mostly familiar tech and adherence to basic physics style of science fiction, with the major plot-serving conceit being the discovery of a method for creating stable wormholes to allow for interstellar travel. It's not Star Trek-style warp drive. It involves entangling two singularities, hauling one of them to the destination at relativistic speeds, expanding both ends, which then allows ships to pass through. It also creates strategic choke points. Yeah, it's techno bullshit, but once its rules are established, they're used consistently. Otherwise, the story adheres fairly well to real physics. Battles between large spacecraft involve rather complex maneuvers, and all that heat has to go somewhere. Starting in 2139, the two books, Through Struggle of the Stars and The Desert of Stars, tell a story of great power competition for habitable planets. The strongest spacefaring colonial powers are China and a resurgent Japan. America has slipped in the rankings, but still holds on as a player in the great game. But as luck would have it, China has been dealt the winning hand. Zones of expansion are established through a combination of who gets there first and international treaties, but only after the boundaries are largely set and the choke points are in place is it discovered that not all slices of the sky are equal. A great barren region of stars beyond those already colonized by the Americans, Japanese, Russians, and Indians. China had reflexively concealed this knowledge, but Second Bureau was certain the Japanese had learned of the phenomenon as well. The Americans, meanwhile, had yet to grasp their future would be confined to a long decline on their paltry 3¼ habitable worlds. But they would learn soon enough. How they learn it and who they learn it from may greatly influence their response. Thus the stage is set for some dicey astropolitical games. Both books are essentially spy thrillers. There's kind of a Tom Clancy vibe to them, and they do it well. What I found most interesting was the big picture of its setting. So while there's obviously some spoilers ahead, I'm going to mostly stick to macro level events and try to leave the character threads alone as much as I can so you can pick up the stories and enjoy the twists and turns, just with a little more world knowledge than you would otherwise have going in. Early in Book 1, there's a skirmish between Japanese and Chinese warships over a colony world. The war is on, and the United States has a choice to make. Perhaps the prospect of our entry into the war on Japan's side would cause China to consider a ceasefire, Donovan said. But I imagine if their back is to the wall, they'll come after us with the stick rather than the carrot. Shortly thereafter, Lieutenant Junior Grade Neil Mercer reports to the USS San Jacinto, hard J, like in Juliet, said a dark-haired male ensign from a seat nearby, smiling broadly. Damn it, we won that battle. Why can't anyone pronounce it right? And Neil ends up assigned as an assistant to Jim Donovan, a CIA, or rather NSS, spook along for the ride. NSS stood for the National Security Service, heir to the old Central Intelligence Agency, rebranded a century prior as punishment for one too many mistakes that made the news. They're on their way to a planet with conflicting claims. The UN recognizes China's claim, but Japan set up a colony anyway. There's a standoff, and a Japanese ship destroys the Chinese colony transports, claiming they were troop ships. Donovan makes sure no report is filed, big hush-hush cover-up, and the Japanese crew invites them to dinner. From here, the war quickly expands, with both China and Japan pulling in a coalition of allies. The United States enters on the side of Japan. The president sees an opportunity. Delgado's American Pride platform was built around returning the country to its former glory, not kowtowing to stronger foreign powers. This book is from 2011, but here in 2025, someone will bring up the obvious Trump parallel if I don't. President Delgado is kind of a MAGA guy in some ways, only in this story, the United States really is a second-tier power trying to reclaim the top spot. And there's a passage that, were it written today, I would assume is trying to take a measured approach to current events. He doesn't accept that American might and righteousness can't fix problems, and he believes the world went wrong when America stopped being the top superpower. He insists we can win somehow, despite the economic realities that knocked us off the top. You almost sound like you don't approve of him. Donovan nodded. He's not terribly pragmatic. That being said, I don't have a high opinion of my opinions about him. I just don't have enough information, and he may be giving smart orders based on things I don't know. Always a possibility one has to consider. And there are people who will read way too much into my saying that. The mission is to pick up a Taiwanese dissident leader from the colony and get him back to Taiwan, where he can stir up the independence movement and give China a problem in their own backyard to deal with. Typical CIA stuff. Of course, it all goes wrong because typical CIA stuff, and the war escalates. The space combat is notable here. People in pressurized tubes shooting projectiles and high-power lasers at each other can get messy real fast. The way the space battles are described really conveys how fragile the ships are, even with armor plating. How much energy it takes to maneuver such massive objects, and how bad vacuum is for dissipating heat. If you like the space combat in The Expanse, Human Reach is that, but better. It also looks at some other aspects of a near-term future. For example, many people have ocular implants that let them not only display information directly into their eyeball, but also some basic controls for data manipulation. Intelligence operators get them as a matter of course, and it seems to offer some real advantages until Donovan gets captured by a vengeful Chinese officer who is able to get access to his ocular and torture him by projecting all manner of horrifying imagery. Closing your eyes doesn't help, it's a direct line to the optic nerve. But it's not all high-tech problems either. Settling frontiers, as always, is difficult and dangerous. Add that the colony worlds all require a fair bit of terraforming work to make them viable for human settlements, and the fact that governments are using the colonies for multiple, often contradictory purposes, and it's going to get a little messy. The colonists themselves are often a combination of people looking for a better life and people their home countries wanted away. I guess I was surprised at how much Greypen was like the shittier parts of Earth. While you were down at the OK Corral, I explored more of the city. A lot of squalor, man. Kids pissing in gutters, gangs, cops abusing their authority. We exported all our crap to these planets. You're twisted up over that? I haven't talked about it because it feels like admitting my dreams are screwed up. A bit of a rebuke to the Star Trek vision. It's also worth noting that this story of a war between America and China fighting over the future of mankind is reaching back to the old Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers ground. The Far East avatars, like Ming the Merciless and Killer Kane and their rockets, are replaced by the People's Liberation Army and their fleet of space battleships. It's not written as a deliberate Yellow Peril throwback, it's just how this war between a pluralist and ethnically diverse society versus a more authoritarian and homogenous one self-frames. Yet because of that, it's in some ways an inheritor of that pulp sci-fi tradition. The American crewmen, and women, even referred to their enemy as the Hans, reminding us of Anthony Rogers and his gang of American underdogs in Armageddon 2419 and the Buck Rogers franchise that followed. Through most of the series, there's a sense of the war being equal parts pride and blunder. It's only well into the second half of the story that both our characters and the general public in the story learn that the American and European space borders on a dead zone. Suddenly the war makes a lot more sense. It's a fight not only for national economic power and prestige, but to determine what cultural tradition will dominate human civilization. A branch point that will determine what humanity becomes for all time going forward. Very high stakes worth fighting over. While book one is solid and probably the better narrative, it's in the second book where, for me at least, the story really hits its stride from a macro level standpoint. The war is already underway and we don't need that slow buildup. We already know the stakes at this point. This lets it get into the complexities of the conflict and also drop some details about the political situation of that world, grounding it in our own while projecting forward in traceable ways. For example, American politics is even more of a mess. Delgado's election marked the 7th straight in which the House of Representatives determined the outcome of the election and the 13th such instance since the four-party era began. India is occupying Pakistan. Colony planets are becoming necessary for a nation's survival, and genetic enhancement is common, though not without controversy. In blithely paving over gene complexes marginally associated with schizophrenia, depression, and even moderate anxiety, we're preventing the slightly mad geniuses who have produced so much of our great art from ever being born. So much art today is hyper-realistic, commercial, and cowardly. We cannot paint or sing or tell stories as we once did. But perhaps most of all, it not only knocks the United States off the top of the ladder, but it also turns us into an aggressive expansionist power again. Once the underlying cause of the war is revealed, there is no more euphemisms about self-defense or fighting for democracy. It's blatantly a land grab on an interstellar scale. We're the invaders in this war. We don't like thinking of ourselves this way. And through it all, there's the remnants of that other future. The one from the Apollo era, the future shown in the early books of the Expanse, of the solar system being settled. In both cases, once you have a reliable means to reach habitable worlds around other stars, no one wants to bother trying to live in a frozen desert. The domes and covered canyons on Mars are becoming a sad little historical footnote, representative of a human space future that was born after the rock but died quickly. But here and there in the solar system were signs of that alternate future. The abandoned surface bases on Callisto and Ceres, the half-hollowed out asteroids, and the derelict terraforming stations on Mars. The rock was an asteroid impact that upset the stagnant balance of power and reminded us of the need to pay attention to space. Like so many other stories of human space exploration, this one has its apocalyptic event that forces us to change course, as though to say, we can't get there from here. The world has to break first. But in this case, it cracks rather than completely shatters. Narratively, it's just enough force to alter the balance of power without creating a hard line between its world and our own. But one of the most noteworthy aspects of the story is that it breaks free from the post-World War II Grand Alliance idea that has shaped our understanding of the 20th century and alliances today. All the participants in the war are involved for rational and self-serving reasons. There's no pretense of fighting for ideals like justice or liberty. The Allies aren't friends, and there's no presumption that the alliances are either natural nor permanent. Making the United States a second-tier power really helps to frame this. We enter the war on Japan's side not because of some cultural affinity or genuine friendship, but to gain planets at China's expense. Later in the war, India and Russia come in on the side of Japan and America, only to withdraw when China gives them the concessions they wanted. While the story is told from the perspective of Americans, it avoids slipping into a clear good versus evil nationalistic kind of mold. The war is between sane, rational entities acting in their own self-interest with mutually exclusive goals. While individual characters can get caught up in petty vengeance or irrational hatred, the story never drops into making the war about some individual's megalomania or mad dream of conquest. It's a believable conflict with coherent motives all around, and the tides of war reflect that. There is a glaring downside to this series. The third book, The Passage of Stars, is not yet available, and given that it's been over a decade and self-publishing a novel is not a lucrative venture, I suspect we'll never know how that war ends. Forever left on a cliffhanger with a great American victory but a looming Chinese offensive. But as a look into a possible future, one with a traceable line from now to then, I'd say it's almost a must-read, not only for the way it presents the impact of technology, but how it treats war not primarily as a series of battles or a collection of competing objectives, but as a constructed narrative. It weaves in many of the ideas that I talk about on this channel frequently, and while I could break that down much further, I think that Lumpkin's Epilogue to the Desert of Stars does an exceptional job of speaking to the creation of those narratives and how war is really driven by story. So I'm just going to read this somewhat lengthy segment, an in-world op-ed piece, and let it stand on its own. We build stories around events to make them make sense. The American story of this war was initially a thing of contention. The Chinese attacked the Sapphire and the San Jacinto, and we had to fight back. But the story made little sense. Why would the Chinese, embroiled in a difficult war with Japan, attack us? So other stories arose to fill the vacuum. This is the long-awaited East versus West war, or the authoritarian versus the democratic, or 20th century powers versus 21st, or some other binary that falls apart under close scrutiny. Consider that the less educated in Japan and China say this is the final reckoning of 1,500 years of their conflict, and America's participation is just a sideshow. Does it feel that way to you with the coffins coming home to Dover? Then, last summer, Senator Gregory offered us a story that made sense. This is a war for territory, for a future in which America isn't a hefty chunk of a single continent, but an interstellar ideal that encompasses whole worlds. We, along with our Japanese and British and Australian and Canadian and Iranian allies, are victims of misfortune of the stars, and a China that's too greedy to share its boon. So we must fight to preserve our future, to prevent our being overrun by a Chinese empire spanning all of our skies. That's a fine story. Let me offer another. Start with the Great Expansion, the one of John Locke and Isaac Newton, the steam engine and the printing press. All the billions who were lifted out of stinking poverty and lived a better life than their parents, first in Europe and North America and Australia and Japan, later in China and India and South America, even a few in Africa. The Asiatic boom was the greatest net improvement in the human condition in history, but it also broke the bank. Our ability to innovate more and more efficient ways to manage energy was exhausted. Our resources were failing and the seas were rising because of the dirty things we did to sustain ourselves. The low-hanging fruits of technology had all been picked. We had solved almost every physical and biological principle that needed solving. The remaining technologies we could envision simply cost too much to develop and employ. Many sensed this, and the states, the corporations, and individuals who had amassed great wealth fought harder and harder to maintain their standard of living. Then came the blessing of the rock, the Roid, 1409222 von Hess, Nubai, Kyriansi, whatever your culture named it. Yes, a blessing, not for the millions of Africans and thousands of Australians and Indians it slaughtered, of course, but for the rest of us who learned we need to ensure the species by going into space. All the wealthy folk found a useful place for their investments, and governments did everything they could to assist them. We got cheap lift, orbital solar power stations, and lo, new worlds to conquer. Thus began a century-long boom, the continuation of the wonderful story of growth via investment, subsidy, and profit. Asteroid mines and starships and colonies and all boats lifting, except, of course, for a lot of Africans and a lot of Indians and a lot of Mexicans and so on. But there was a problem, one nobody likes to talk about. We never actually made any money beyond the moon. I mean real money, not revenue, but true profit after you count all society's shared costs in getting the program going. The tax incentives, government-backed bonds, deferred loan payments, and so on. No, it's cheaper to send nanorefiners into the old landfills than it is to mine most of the asteroids for terrestrial projects, and it's cheaper still to use tried and true methods of strip mining and polluting. And there are very few things that are made on our colonies that can't be made here. Interstellar transport of mass-produced goods is in almost all cases economically unfeasible. It has taken a while for that to shake out, but many of the big space investors started to cash in their chips about a decade ago. Solar power and orbital access were in the realm of the controlled profits provided to utilities. For work beyond Earth space, subsidies and tax breaks were dropping, and the capitalists did what they always do when they run out of ideas. They try to turn themselves into aristocrats, walling themselves off legally, financially, and physically from the rest of us. Don't hate them. You would probably do the same if you were in their position. And they did help extend the economic boom the Enlightenment brought us for another century. Now the bubble is bursting. The desert of stars Senator Gregory told us about has only hurried the process along. But he was wrong. We're fighting this war not for planets, but for dominance on Earth. The winner controls the direction Earth's economy will go and who gets to maintain their standard of living as the rest of the world begins a bitter decline. As I said, I'm just offering one more story of the war. It's a series of factual assertions I strung together with a common thread. Perhaps you prefer the clash of cultures or the Lebensraum stories that are already well known to humanity. Perhaps you'll take this narrative and incorporate it into your own, most likely in opposition to it, casting me as some opponent to progress or the military or America. Perhaps the story you believe says more about your politics than the reality of things. But none of that means our stories are arbitrary. Quite the opposite is true, as they guide our decisions whether to negotiate with a rival or send thousands of good boys and girls to their deaths. If there's one simple lesson to take from this story, it's kill the psycho bad guy when you get a chance. Neil's whole "I'm not a murderer" thing wore thin real fast.